So by now we got components everywhere. We got the expenses component, expense item, expense date, app, yeah, a lot of components. But that really is what React is all about. Now, obviously, throughout this course, we're going to learn about more features which we can add to these components to make them more interactive, to improve their performance, to send HTTP requests, and much more. But in a nutshell, and that's really important, it's all about components. And it's about props for configuring these components, for passing data into them. And components really just are these custom HTML elements where you combine HTML code, JSX code to be precise, and styling, and if you want to, also extra JavaScript logic, as we're doing it in expense state. That is really what components are about. Now, I did mention it multiple times already. We build all these components to then build a user interface. And we are already doing that. In app.js, we're using expenses. In there, we are using expense item. In there, we're using expense state. Generally, this approach of building a user interface from smaller building blocks is called composition. Now, there's one specifically interesting aspect of composition which we haven't seen thus far though. What if we wanted to create a component which actually just serves as a shell around any kind of other content? At the moment, we have highly specific components. The expense date component is about outputting a date in exactly that format and in exactly that look. The expense item component is just about outputting an expense item. And in your React application, you will always have a lot of these very specific components. All these components are also just configured through props, through the date prop, the title prop, the amount prop, in the case of expense item, for example. And again, that is fairly standard. You'll have a lot of these components in your React applications. Sometimes, however, you want to have a component where you don't configure everything through props, but where instead you're able to pass content between the opening and closing tags of that component. And here's an example where this would make sense. If we have a look at our current output, then we see two kind of boxes or containers. We got a container around all the expense items. It has a light gray background and rounded corners and a slight drop shadow, which might be hard to see. And we have a container around the overall expenses list with a darker gray background, but also rounded corners and a slight drop shadow. Now, the idea behind all these components is to have reusable building blocks, also to avoid code duplication. And here at the moment, we at least have some style duplication, also maybe some HTML structure duplication. Expenses has a div which surrounds our expenses, which applies certain styles thanks to this class. And the same is true for expense item. Now, of course, not all divs have the same look though. Inside of our expense items, we also got divs like this one, which have a totally different look. Nonetheless, we could extract this surrounding container div, which we have both in expense item and expenses.js, and extract the styles they have in common, like rounded corners and a drop shadow, into a separate component. And we could name such a component card, because this is a specific card look. And this is not a term I came up with. Instead, in general, in web development, when you hear the term card, it typically means some kind of container look with rounded corners, drop shadows, and elements like this. So that's why I'm picking card as a name here. Now, such a card component is still a regular component here. So let's create it as such. But such a card component could now do one main thing. It could return a div or any other kind of container HTML element with a class name of, let's say, card. And then we could add a card CSS file and import that into that card component. So import card.css. And now in the card CSS file, we could have, let's say, the box shadow and the border radius from expenses CSS. Maybe we would be able to extract more styles, but I'll go with these two. I'll cut them from expenses CSS and add them to card CSS inside of a card CSS class selector, which I added there. I will also go to expense item CSS, and here in expense item in this class selector, we also find a box shadow and a border radius. So I will remove these styles from there as well. Now, why am I doing that? Just to show this kind of component. Now we got this card container component, you could say, which should act as a shell around either our expense item content or our expenses content. And that's the key. This card component will now not be configured through some attributes. Instead, my idea would be that, let's say, an expense item, we can simply replace this built-in div with our custom card component. And then we get these predefined styles for the card automatically. Maybe we then just want to make them extensible, but we get these predefined styles automatically. And for that, of course, we want to import card from ./card inside of expense item. The thing just is, if I save that, you will see that all the expense items are lost. And the reason for that is that out of the box, just like that, you can't use your custom components as wrappers around other kind of content. Having content between opening and closing tags doesn't work just like that. But of course it does work for built-in HTML elements like the div or the h2 tag. So it would be nice if we could also make it work for our custom components to build such reusable wrapper components like this, for example. And of course, React has a solution here. We can build such wrapper components. In card.js, we again want to accept props, but now, as I mentioned, we'll not work with some attributes, but instead we will use one special prop which is built into React, which every component receives, even if you're never setting it explicitly. And that's a prop which value I want to output between the opening and closing tag of this div inside of the card component function. It's the props children prop. Children is a reserved name. We don't set a children prop on this card. I'm setting a class name prop, and actually at the moment this won't do anything. But I'm not setting a children prop. Children, as I said, is a reserved name, and the value of this special children prop will always be the content between the opening and closing tags of your custom component. So in this case, this content between the opening and closing card tag, that is what will be available on props children inside of that card. And therefore, if I now save this, we got some content back. However, it's also a bit broken. And the reason for that is that I extracted some styles, which expense item and expenses had in common, but I had more styles defined for expense items, and these styles are important. But they are missing now. I am setting a class name prop on card here, but you must not forget that card is now a custom component defined by you. All the default HTML components out of the box support class name for adding CSS classes to the rendered HTML elements. But your custom components only support what you tell them to support. So if you want to make sure that a class name can be set on your card component and then has an effect, we have to tweak the code in the card component. And here we would probably want to tweak it such that we add whatever is set as a class name on card to this class name string we're setting as a class name on that div. So here we could add a classes constant, which is card as a default class, which is always applied, white space, plus props class name. So now anything we receive as a class name from outside is added to that string. And here we can then dynamically point at this class's constant. So with that, we're now making sure that any value set on the class name prop is added to this long string of class names, which is then finally set on this div inside of the card. And with that, if we save that, we got the same look as before, not yet for expenses, but for the expense items. But now we have this reusable wrapper component. Now we can also use that in expenses now. Here, instead of using a div, we can also use our card component. We can import card from ./card and replace this div here with that card, still setting an extra class name here as well, and also replace the closing tag. And if we do that, now we get the rounded corners back on that expenses container as well. Now, why would we do that? What did we gain by doing that? Well, in this case, of course, not a whole lot, but we were able to extract some code duplication from inside our CSS files into this separate wrapper component. And it's not just a duplicate CSS code. We also were able to extract this HTML code, this JSX code, this div here. In this case, it's just one div. But throughout the course, you will also see more complex wrapper components, which might have a more complex JSX structure, things like modals and alerts. And in such cases, being able to extract that often allows you to save a lot of code duplication, and it often allows you to keep your other components clean. And this is another aspect of composition. We compose our expense item component by using card as a wrapper, by using some built-in HTML elements, and by then also putting in the expense state. And all these components and elements are composed together to form the overall expense item component, which then again is used in other components to in the end overall build the overall user interface. So composition is important. You use it all the time when working with React. Whenever you combine components, you are using composition. And an especially important part of composition is this props children feature, which allows you to also create wrapper components, which is a special type of component, you could say, which you also sometimes need. Now again, as with all these things, you are of course going to see many more examples throughout the course. Remember, this section was about components. It was about understanding the most important concept of React, that you build user interfaces by building and combining components. And for that, we had a look at the React core syntax and JSX. We of course had a very detailed look at building and using and working with components and props. And that already leads to the last part, data. We learned how to share data across components through that props concept. Now maybe you already noticed one important thing. With all these components which we are building, in the end, we're just splitting up our code across multiple files and building blocks, so that if we want to have more than one expense item, we can just use our custom expense item component multiple times, instead of repeating all that code multiple times. That's the idea behind components. In the end, what ends up on the screen are just default HTML elements though. If you inspect your page with the developer tools, here in the Chrome developer tools with the Elements tab, you will notice that you don't see your custom components here. There is no card or expense item component, you just see divs and h2 elements and so on. And that is how the web works and how React works. These custom components are not really HTML elements which end up on the screen. You just use them in your code, in your React code, in your JSX code. What ends up on the screen are just the HTML elements, because ultimately every custom component you build either uses these built-in HTML elements, or it uses another component which at some point, if you drill into your components deeply enough, will end up using these built-in elements. And that's an important takeaway and something important to keep in mind. Now, the application we built thus far is great because we had the chance of learning about components and props with it. And these are two of the most important concepts you gotta know when working with React. I'm not sure if I mentioned it already. But of course, this application, as we built it thus far, also has a downside. In the end, it's still static. Yes, we have reusable components which can be configured with props, but ultimately we have this expenses array in the app.js file, and this array never changes. The data here is set in stone. It's still a static application in the end. Nothing is changing here. As a user, we have no chance of interacting with this application. And that's therefore what we're going to change in the next course section when we're going to bring this to life and when we're going to learn about another concept called state. Now, before we go there though, I just got 3 other things which I want to cover here. The first thing, the first concept is JSX. I mentioned that we'll take a closer look at that, and we're going to do that in the next lecture. You could skip that lecture, but at some point you should have a look at it so that you understand what JSX really is under the hood and how it works. So I recommend that you don't skip it, even though you could do that if you're in a hurry. Now, the other 2 things I want to have a look at is how we organize our files and how we write our functions here. And therefore, let's dive into these concepts before we finish this module and move on to the next course section. Let's have a closer look at JSX. Now, I mentioned before, earlier in this module, you can open up your developer tools, and there you'll find the JavaScript code which is responsible for what you're seeing on the page. And in there, you will also find all your component functions, like this app function here. Now, it will look totally different in the end, because there you have no JSX code, because JSX code isn't supported by the browser. This in the end is just syntactic sugar, which works here thanks to the behind-the-scenes transformations. Now, we can see that the code to which it is transformed in the end looks like this here, right? This here is the code to which it is transformed. Now, this is code which still is fairly cryptic, because this actually is the final step of the transformation. We could also write code instead of this JSX code, which is a bit more readable to us humans than this, but not as readable as the JSX code. I still want to show it to you because this shows you what this JSX code actually represents behind the scenes. So here we go. Maybe you already wondered about one other thing. In package.json, we got a bunch of dependencies, and most of them are just dealing with the behind-the-scenes transformations. But we got 2 dependencies which are related to React. React and React DOM. Now, we are using React DOM in the index.js file, but we are never using React anywhere. We're never importing React anywhere. And this actually just works in this kind of project setup and in all modern React project setups which are created by Create React App. In a lot of other React projects which you'll find out there in the wild, you will actually see React imports, even though we don't have them here. Because in the past, in older React projects, you actually needed to import React from React in all your React component files. To be precise, in all files where you used JSX. You needed to always import React from React in the past. And you'll still see a lot of React projects out there which have these imports therefore. Now that we can omit this import now is really just some magic being done by modern React project setups. We needed this import in the past because this JSX code, as I mentioned, is just syntactic sugar. And under the hood, it is actually transformed to methods called on this React object, which is why we needed to import React in the past. Now let me show you what this code would look like if we wouldn't use this JSX syntax. And therefore I'll comment this out and return this alternative. Because on this imported React object, there is a createElement method which we can call. And when you use JSX, it's in the end this method which is called. CreateElement takes 3 arguments. The first argument is the element which should be created. For example, a div. And if it's a built-in HTML element, you just pass in a string with the name of that element, like div. The second argument is an object that configures this element. Specifically, an object which sets all the attributes of this element. This div has no attributes, so here we can pass in an empty object. The third argument now is the content between the opening and closing div tags. And actually, it's not just a third argument. You can now have an infinitely long list of arguments, which are the different content pieces between the opening and closing tags. So here we have 2 elements, so we would have 2 extra arguments. The third argument would be our h2 element, so the first child in that div. And therefore here, again, we would call React createElement and create a h2 element here. And that h2 element again has no attributes, so the second argument of this second createElement call would be an empty object. And the third argument of this createElement call would be the content in this h2 tag, so this string in this case. So we would pass this string here and escape this single quote. And if we now format it, it would look like this. Now, next to this second createElement call, we could have a third createElement call, which is the neighbor element to this h2 element, so this expenses component. Again, we create an element here, but now we're working with a custom component instead of a built-in one. In such cases, you don't use a string here, but you just point at your imported function, which it in the end is, because your components are just functions, right? So here we set expenses. We point at expensive as an element here. The second argument is an object of properties that should be set, of attributes that should be set. And here we have the items prop, the items attribute. So we would add an items key here. Keep in mind, this is just a JavaScript object. So we have the property name and then a colon and then the value, which here would be expenses. And then as a third argument, we have the content between the opening and closing tags. And in this case, there is no such content, so we omit it. And this here would be the alternative to this JSX code using this React object. And therefore, if I save that, and we go back to the screen, we see exactly the same as before. Now, you could write your entire React app like this. It just turns out that this is a bit harder to read and a bit more cumbersome than using this JSX code. But that's why you needed to import React from React in all your component files in the past, because this is the under-the-hood code which kind of gets created automatically when you use JSX. Now, in more modern project setups, you can omit this React import because the project setup is able to make that transformation without the import being added. But if you see component functions where this import is there, it is there because in the past you always did need to add it. And therefore, because of that reason, I will now also import it and add it to all components where I use some JSX code, like here index.js, expenses.js, expense item.js, expense date.js, and card.js. Again, you technically don't need to do that, but I'm doing it to really emphasize that React is still being used under the hood here. when you use JSX code, because that code under the hood is transformed to something like this before it's then transformed even more to what we saw in the browser earlier. That's important. And if you have a look at this code, it should also be clear why you need some wrapping element as a root JSX element, why you can't have just these two side-by-side elements being returned. Because how would you write this in the React create element world? You, in the end, would be trying to return this, and that doesn't work. You can't return more than one thing. You could return an array, sure, but this is not an array of elements. This is two separate elements side by side. That's why you always need such a wrapper, because in the create element world, you always create one element, which then may have more child elements. So that's why we have this one wrapper root JSX element, which we always need. This is why we need that. That's the under the hood, behind the scenes stuff that is going on. Now I will comment this out and go back to the JSX solution, because of course we're going to write JSX code in the course. After all, this is way more convenient. But it is important to understand what is happening under the hood and how React works. So now in the last lecture, we learned about JSX and how it looks like under the hood, and why we therefore could add all these React imports to all these files which hold JSX code. Speaking of the files, let's talk about organizing them. Here, we only got a couple of components, and therefore we can store them like this. But as your project grows, and as you have more and more components, you might want to organize them into subfolders and not just throw them all into one components folder. And indeed, that is something we can already get started with. Here, we could argue that we have some general UI components, some general user interface elements which are not tied to a specific feature of the app. And then we got some feature-specific components, like these components which are dealing with rendering expenses and expense data. And therefore, in the components subfolder, we could create an expenses subfolder, and next to that, a UI subfolder for general user interface elements. And we could move the card files into the UI folder, and the expenses, expense item, and expense date files into the expenses folder. Now you just want to make sure that you update all your imports. Like in expenses.js, where we import card, we now first of all need to go up one level with 2 dots and then a slash, and then dive into the UI folder and import card, the card file. We need to go up one level because expenses is now in the expenses folder, and we need to get out of that folder into the next folder above it to then dive into the UI folder, which is a sibling folder to expenses, to the expenses folder, I mean. We don't need to update the other imports because these files are still in the same folder as expenses.js. For expense item, we also need to update the card import though. Go up one level, dive into the UI folder, and then import card. And in app.js, we no longer import expenses from components expenses. Instead, we dive into components, then into the expenses folder, and there it's the expenses file which we want to import from. So now we can adjust these imports, and if you did that, this again all works if you load it. And we're really just doing this to organize our files and to keep our components organized and to make sure that they're not all in one big folder. Ultimately, it's up to you how you want to organize them, and of course you should just organize them such that you and any team members you might be working with are comfortable working with these files. That's the most important thing which matters. Now, to really conclude this module, I just want to show you an alternative syntax for writing these functions, any kinds of functions in JavaScript. A syntax which is not exclusive to React, by the way, but which can be used in any modern JavaScript application. Instead of writing a function like this with the function keyword, You can also write a so-called arrow function. And attached you find a link with more details on these arrow functions. Again, it's not a React specific thing. To use that arrow function syntax, you replace function with const to create a new constant with a given name, app in this case. And then the value which you assign to this constant is an arrow function written like this. A list of parameters, then an equal sign and a greater sign, forming such an arrow, and then the function body between curly braces. And again, that's really just standard JavaScript code. You can absolutely stick to the function keyword. This is just a syntax which I personally prefer because it's a bit shorter, or yeah, I just prefer it. And therefore I will migrate all my functions to this syntax, like this here in the case of card, but you don't have to do that if you prefer the other syntax. It's really 100% optional, and in this case here, it doesn't offer any benefits or anything like that. It's really just personal preference, and I want to show this syntax here, since you also see that in a lot of React projects, and you therefore should be aware of it, that you can write your functions like this. Any functions, by the way, not just component functions. And with that, we're really done for this module. It was a huge module, and yet we're still only scratching the surface. There's way more to explore about React, and the next thing we are going to explore is how we can make this a bit more interactive and reactive. Because currently it's all static. This data never changes. As a user, we can't do anything about it. And we are building modern user interfaces with React because we typically want to build user interfaces where things can change. Therefore, in the next course section, we are going to dive into another important React concept, state, because that will help us make our applications interactive.